Hello, and welcome to this latest Procurement Leaders webinar. Today with our friends at GEP. It's really a pleasure to be here, and the topic for conversation today is really something which is probably top of mind and at the top of the priority list for many of the organizations that we and GEP work with. And that is sustainability ESG, and we're going to get into it in a lot more detail. But the title, as you can see, Beyond the Sustainability Pledge, How Procurement and Supply Chain Teams Can Move the Enterprise from Intent to Action. My name is David Ray. I'm Chief Product Officer at Procurement Leaders, and it's my pleasure to be facilitating this session for the next hour or so. But it's not about me, obviously. It's about our speakers and participants on the call today. And let me introduce them. Nehar Shah, President and Co-founder of GEP. Nehar guides the company's growth initiatives by building and managing strategic C-level relationships with clients and leading complex transformation engagements. Then we have Jagadish Tirumella, otherwise known as JT, which you'll probably hear throughout the conversation today. JT is Chief Operating Officer and co-founder at GEP. He leads a consulting practice and oversees the company's operations. Under his leadership, the company has grown into a leading procurement and supply chain consulting, outsourcing, and technology firm. And it's won many accolades along the way as well. And then we have Paul Blake, who is Senior Director Engagement at GEP. And as Senior Director Engagement, Paul has been with the company for 10 years. He's worked in technology for over 35 years, and he is also willing to admit that he's been in the development of business software since before the advent of the internet. So whether that's wise to admit that or not, I don't know. So these are the panelists today. We have a great conversation. We have a great conversation in store. Before we do get into that conversation, there's obviously some housekeeping items that we'd like to just take you through. So there are additional resources available during and following the webinar. So look at the additional resources tab. Please do submit questions. We'd like these to be engaging, interactive. So you'll see the Q&A box. Please do put some questions in there so we can have a nice Q&A session at the end. Feedback naturally is always important for us to help us improve. So do fill out the survey question at the end of the webinar. And if you have any technical difficulties, I really hope not. But if you do, check out the help section. There's lots of information there. And if you need to, then just contact us via the question box, and that will and we'll get back to you and help to solve whatever issue that you have. So that's the boring stuff out of the way. We'll get on to the more interesting stuff right now. Before we do, we're going to just play a short video. And it's the CEO of GEP. So, you know, he's not here with us today, but he's going to be sharing a few thoughts via video. Subhash is his name, and let me just play this, and and then we'll get into the conversation shortly.
Recently, SEC announced a proposal for sweeping changes to the rules governing climate-related disclosures, and if ratified, those rules will require companies to measure and disclose all direct and indirect greenhouse gas emissions. While sustainability has risen in importance on all of our targets and agendas, progress has been slow and uneven. If we are to progress, we need to move our energies outside of the four walls of our physical plants into extended, mostly externalized supply chains. These Scope 3 activities comprise about 70 to 90% of carbon emissions. Indeed, while now the large majority of global GDP is under commitment to meet zero carbon targets by 2050, only a small percentage of companies are on track to achieve these targets. While the company may commit to aggressive targets at a high level, teams in procurement and supply chain operations are still measured on traditional cost savings and efficiencies. We need to make sustainability targets as a key agenda for the procurement and supply chain professionals. So what is procurement and supply chain leaders can do now? In a really practical way to begin move the company towards achieving these sustainability goals, what programs, tactics, and tools should we focus on to begin this journey? Well, that's what this discussion is all about. At GEP, our customers are the world's brightest and the best companies, and working with them, we have amassed a huge amount of data, knowledge, and experience on how these companies are leading in the sustainability space. Over the next hour, we would like to share some of these insights with you. I thank you for attending today's webinar, and we are with you all the way in our mutual journey to a more sustainable future.
Okay, what a great message. So, but you know, there's quite a lot of pressure here, right? This is a major challenge ahead of us, and the people on this line today, and the people within the procurement leaders community, the people that you guys work with, are in the firing line. They really are in the crosshairs for delivering against some of these goals. So welcome to my panelists today. It's great to have you here. Thank you for giving us the time. We're going to be discussing a few things. So how to identify high impact supply chain projects that come up today, how to accelerate the maturity of a supply chain sustainability agenda, how to link procurement sustainability work with wider corporate ESG goals, and much more besides, I'm sure. But let's get going, and let me stop talking. I mean, Neha, JT, given the huge range of challenges covered by the term ESG, how can companies decide where to start when setting their goals? I mean, that's the crux. How do people even get started?
Sure, David. So maybe I'll get started. So thank you again for that warm introduction, and very excited to be here. I know we have many procurement and supply chain professionals across the world who are attending today, but to start at a little bit higher level, about ESG. ESG, of course, many individuals think about it in terms of investing, but we, on the front lines and operational side of things, we think about sustainability and making pretty much each of our investments, actions, decisions, and our companies more sustainable in the long run. And so while today's discussion, we're going to be talking a lot about really operationalizing and making real change at the operational level of procurement and supply chain, we can take a step back to start with thinking about, you know, why ESG, why sustainability overall. And I think first, as anybody in an organization, either running an organization, running a procurement organization, or doing the day-to-day work, it's really important to think about sustainability and how it connects with our company's values and the vision of the company, because that really will inform how you set up the program, what sort of short and medium and long-term goals that you have. Now, most of us here on this call are probably here for many reasons. We're here because we know that ESG improves the value and the performance of our companies, but we also have I think many of us, and probably all of us here, have a genuine interest to do better, to do less harm, to create a net positive impact, as Paul Pullman speaks about in his work, on the world, beyond just providing our products and services. And so I'll let JT talk about kind of the very specific steps that companies can take in terms of ESG. But what I'll leave this group with is, it really is important about asking yourself why, how to inculcate the sustainability in your overall culture. And depending on which organization you're from, it could be either a serious challenge, but also at the same time, a great opportunity. So I'll leave you with a few thoughts. One is, of course, prioritizing the areas that make most sense given your company and industry. Be willing to invest in sustainability on multiple levels, because sustainability is something that is not just about baseline and targets, but rather really sustaining for the future. There are many opportunities to kind of, they're not easy problems. Data and lots of things are challenges, but they're not impossible, especially in today's day and age. And beyond the baseline and targets and reporting, which again, JT is going to talk about in a second, I think we have to, and as Subhash talked about, really think about our companies, all of our investments, projects, decisions with sustainability in mind, whether it's HR, procurement, supply chain, or otherwise. And this will be a major shift for most large organization enterprises who don't have the luxury to start from a blank page like startups do. So I think these are some of the overall things that I think companies at a corporate-wide level should be thinking about. And now I'll turn it over to JT to maybe talk about some of the steps to get started.
Thank you, Neha. And also thank you, David, for moderating the session, and for Procurement Leaders for hosting this. And thanks for all the attendees for joining today. As you can imagine, this space has been a pretty hot topic, but at the same time, it's also highly confusing and overwhelming, flooded with so many different acronyms, so many different frameworks, so many different reporting disclosure, reporting guidelines and standards. But the good news, I think, is that these are converging. Eventually, they're converging, and we've seen some of these things like the GRI, the Reporting Institute, and some of the UN SDG, the Sustainability Development Goals that started over a decade ago, and then some of the new recent ones, the SASB, Sustainable Accounting Standards Boards, and some of the CDSB, the Climate Disclosure Standards Boards. All of these are now converging. So those 5 major ones are now converging into developing somewhat of a standard. There is still, not one golden standard like we have in the financial reporting in terms of following the GEP rules and reporting on the financial reporting, but they are converging. So it's a lot less crowded, and it's converging today. So I can imagine how that can be overwhelming with all of these. So what we are trying to accomplish here is that in this conversation, what we want to kind of demystify some of that, and then simplify some of that frameworks, and then see what is emerging as the framework that's relevant for your sector, for your industry, and what are some of the topics that are material to your company. And then what is the audience you're trying to cater to? Is this the investor audience you're trying to cater to, or the overall, all the combined stakeholders that you're catering to? Some of the SASB framework are more catered towards the investor audience that are, what is the financial impact of these risks, et cetera. And versus some of the GRI and UN SDG goals are catered towards the overall stakeholder goals. And what is the impact of the community, customers, suppliers, and the geographies and the climate that we operate in. And many companies are actually reporting on more than one. And there is eventually some mapping and some references of these, so you don't have to redo some of that work. So given that broad context of these different frameworks and reporting disclosures, where do you get started? It is an overwhelming question. So we are trying to demystify some of that with a simple 3-step process. And one is to simply start with a overall materiality assessment, which kind of really breaks down into what is the overall goals for ESG goals for your company, and which are the audience you're trying to cater to some of these ESG goals and metrics. And that involves doing the analysis of the current footprint, current baseline metrics, and where you are today, and then setting the goals and targets and setting the policies. So that's step number 1. The second step is then, once you have these, engage these stakeholders, and this is again a very cross-functional team. It's not chief sustainability officer's job, because the head of supply chain is controlling all of the spend for production, for manufacturing, and the CPO is controlling all the spend for all your scope 3 and external spend. So those are 2 key stakeholders that are actually owning the budgets for how the money is being spent and how the footprint is being calculated and measured. There are other, of course, there are other stakeholders as well, including the finance, risk, and HR for some of the social initiatives, et cetera. Those are all stakeholders that are that's the cross-functional team that should develop a policy. And then the step 2 is to really kind of developing the roadmap on how do we go about not just thinking about net zero by 2050, but what are the intermediate goals by 1, 2, 5 years, and then every 5-year, recurring 5 years, what are the intermediate goals that we're setting up the target to. And then the last step is the disclosure and filing. We have moved away from today, putting some pretty pictures in our CSR reports of CSR activities of our employees doing some initiatives. From today, where many companies are reporting their sustainability reports as part of their annual reports, as part of their 10K, 10Q filings. So these are very audited reports with assurances that are subject to litigation for any misrepresentation, et cetera. So that's where the world is moving, and so those are kind of the high level framework to demystify some of that overwhelming space.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, JT. I mean, it's clear that the stakes are very high, not just for the obvious reasons of the planet and equality, etc., but also for for the legalities around this now, when it's involved in with audit and all this. So, there's legal implications of what we do and how we report what we do. But maybe Neha, maybe I could go back to you. To what extent should different goals, for example, carbon emissions or diversity, be pursued independently? I mean, because this is a big challenge in ESG. Three small letters represents a huge expanse of challenge. So, or is it best practice to have a single approach for all of this, all of these areas?
So I think, David, it is, again, kind of coming back to, as JT described, the materiality. All of these areas for most large enterprises are relevant, whether it's human rights, it's climate, and within climate, there's water preservation, there's carbon, there's so many waste, many areas. And I think based on the materiality, based on prioritization, it is important to look at a comprehensive kind of ESG program. And as I mentioned earlier, making those right investments. That being said, if you set kind of very aggressive goals and targets across a wide range of areas, I do believe as a philosophy, not only with ESG, but overall, that really kind of prioritizing what makes sense for your organization and really focusing on what is realistic and stretch in the short term and then over the long term is something every company must go through. In addition, I wanted to add that we think about these individual ESG areas as silos, but in fact, they're very interrelated. As some people may know, I'm very involved in areas as it relates to human rights and child labor. But what we find is as we dig deeper in the data, we find that many of those issues are directly related to deforestation. And then deforestation has is related to many other areas. And so if we think about, again, what makes sense for our company, our industry, of course, across all elements, they will make sense. It is important to prioritize. It is important to set realistic goals. And it is important, but at the same time, it's really important to understand the interconnectedness of all of these issues. So I think that's something to keep in mind when setting up these type of ESG programs. Anything you want to add, JT?
No, I think there is a integrated reporting aspect that's actually becoming more and more popular that takes both the financial aspects of it and as well as some of the like GRI metrics that cover some of the broader community and geography outside of the company, some that related to that have impact on the overall planet and the humanity metrics, combined with those that actually have the impact with financial impact for the company itself. I think both are important, and both are actually the integrated reporting, that is combining those two with SASB, and then the CDP reporting. Those are all combined metrics that are actually becoming more and more popular.
I think one other thing I wanted to add, David, you mentioned the laws and regulations. That is an ever-evolving ecosystem out there right now. So as many of the audience probably knows, there's obviously country-by-country regulation. There's overall EU regulation, and in US, the human rights due diligence, for instance, kind of covers a lot of areas. Even though it's called HRDD, it covers many, many areas. So it's really important to, of course, understand those nuances, and as JT described, have a program that covers those areas, of course, to mitigate risk, to do what's right, of course, and ultimately, not only, again, kind of baseline and report, but more importantly, make real changes in the operations and in those kind of operational decisions, which we'll get to in a moment, that will make real impactful change in your supply chain, in your procurement decisions. And that's what we're going to talk about next, I believe.
Yeah. Thanks, Neha. So that is what we're going to talk about next, because it's right. Let's get to it. I mean, let's get practical. How do we translate these ESG goals into into our world, into category and sourcing strategies, into procurement strategies? I mean, how do we sort of like make the rubber hit the road, as it were, and get and create impact here? So JT, can I go to you first with that?
Sure, David. I think, as we talked about, step one is to start with a, overall materiality assessment that includes this cross-functional team that involving all of the, it's the Chief Sustainability Officer, CPO, and the head of supply chain, and also including some of the other stakeholders on risk and finance and HR. Now, once the materiality assessment is completed, then you have a policy, you have certain targets and goals, ESG goals, with some timelines, et cetera. And a lot of the changes in terms of the roadmap is within the supply chain, as we've talked about, and then also the procurement. That's where the budget owners are, and then that's where the dollars are being spent. So really working with the supply chains, supply chain controls all of the production, manufacturing within the four walls of the company, where the large amounts of, for example, if you take the E part of the environment part of it, then large part of the greenhouse gas emissions for scope 1 and 2 are within the control and influence of the supply chain and the manufacturing and production units, which are reporting to the supply chain officers. And then if you think about the scope 3, that's again, with all of the upstream, downstream spend, and also all the transportation, from the sourcing of the materials and services, as well as the shipping of the products and services into the customers. So all of those are part of the Chief Procurement Officer's spend. So really developing a roadmap on what is the current footprint, starting with the current footprint. I mean, if you think about it, GEP, we've been doing a spend analysis for over 25 years. So this is somewhat similar, in a similar manner. What we're doing now is taking, a spend of let's say a $10 billion of external spend, and you could slice and dice it and build all the analytics and look at all the ESG characteristics of that spend. So how much is my greenhouse gas emissions by supplier, by plant, by geography, by business unit, et cetera, et cetera. And that's part of the step number one in terms of understanding exactly where we are on the for example, if we delve into the greenhouse gas emissions, how many metric tons of CO2 equivalent is my current footprint as a baseline. Then you could have the roadmaps on developing, how do you go about reducing, on applying some renewable energy techniques and strategies, on developing the overall ESG strategy, and then on a roadmap to reducing those. Some of those in scope 3 especially will involve very much within the CPO and then working with the suppliers. And many of our clients are actually working with their suppliers in not only brainstorming and conducting workshops and coming up with product ideas, demand reduction ideas on reducing that overall greenhouse gas emissions, but also putting some teeth into the supplier contracts on working with them on what the supplier goals are, metrics are, and targets are on an annual basis. So it has become a very key evaluation criteria on supplier selection, supplier elimination, based on these ESG metrics and criteria, and also within the supplier contracts that are with some teeth, with some incentives to meet mutual target goals on ESG, and some penalties for not meeting some of those. So very similar to how the corporate level overall ESG reporting in the financial side, in the regulation side is changing. In the same way, we can also have a very similar impact on within the procurement and supply chain, working with the suppliers and working with our internal plants and production units.
If I may add, David, maybe summarize and then add a little bit. I think within the procurement function and supply chain functions, there's a vast amount of data that exists within the spend, the category spend and supplier data. Being able to leverage the data within the four walls of your company to look at it for a little bit different purpose. Historically, it's about kind of cost savings, effectiveness, and efficiency. That same data can give us insight into all of the things that JT mentioned in terms of carbon footprint, human rights risk, so on and so forth. So there's many opportunities to basically find, collect data, and actually gain different level of insight, of course, using people and technology both to be able to utilize that data, not only within the four walls, but also within the supplier base. In all of the sourcing decisions, having kind of sustainability as a key focus. Of course, there's the total cost of ownership and analysis that all of us have been trained on, and the process by which to evaluate and make decisions. Now, as I mentioned earlier, having kind of sustainability be a core focus of that in terms of all of the decisions from supplier selection, mode of delivery and transportation, alternate sources of supply based on human rights risk are some examples that can be put directly into those kind of decisions. And then, of course, in the contracting, as JT mentioned, one of the things that has become very more relevant these days is suppliers kind of self-reporting where they are across sustainability metrics, signing off on things like the Modern Slavery Act. And although those are important steps, those are table stakes, because we know that in and of itself is not sufficient to make enough goals or enough change happen. It is one step, but it's not sufficient. So there's many other opportunities to find data sources and in a real-time way make those potential risk areas more known through the data. And then finally, one thing I wanted to add is that many companies, in addition to everything that JT just mentioned, are really within their sourcing procurement are carving out an area in kind of making an impact or responsible sourcing. So historically, 10, 20 years ago, a lot of companies focused on diversity of supplier base and created supplier diversity within their overall organizations and their procurement organization. And that was a tremendous first step. And many companies have made a lot of progress there. But now rolling up not only supplier diversity, but overall impact, overall responsible sourcing is an area that companies are developing strategies. We're helping many companies do that and then implement those responsible sourcing techniques, policies, organizations that will affect all of their categories of spend, both their direct and indirect side. And I think that is another area by which companies can make the next level of investment and really track not only, of course, supplier diversity, but the impact they're making on marginalized communities across the world, job creation, lifting people out of poverty. There's many, many opportunities. And the forward-leading companies are doing a lot in that space to make significant strides. And the final thing I'll add in supply chain operations is, again, there's the decisions on the sourcing and contracting, but then on the ground supply chain decisions, whether it's related to inventory or warehouse, there are opportunities utilizing technology and cultural change to not only make decisions based on, again, what's going to save me money, what's going to get me from point A to point B as quickly as possible, but be able to incorporate sustainability even at the ground level of decision making on the plant floor. And so there's many, many innovations that are happening in that space as well.
Great stuff. Thanks, Neha. Paul, can I?
Yeah, let me add a thought here, if I may. Thank you, David. Thinking back to one of the things that Subhash said in his introductory video, there is an issue for many companies, I feel, in translating those ESG goals into action at a ground level for procurement and supply chain operations, in that the procurement operations in particular are still measured by the traditional performance metrics that they always have. And it is making sure that there is inclusion of the ESG goals really from a very early stage in how performance is measured in procurement, not just on pure cost reduction alone. That is the secret of success. I picked up a tweet just a few days ago, in fact, which was really interesting. And it said that my worry with sustainability roles is that they become enablers of the current system, whereas the only thing that is going to stop the planet from becoming uninhabitable is system change. And I think what the person who tweeted that meant by that was, it's all very well signing up to these particular goals and perhaps appointing a sustainability officer within the procurement team, but unless you give them the teeth in order to execute and indeed measure the success and reward the success in an appropriate way, it's going to be very hard to change the rules of the game for the procurement operation. And indeed, just yesterday, MasterCard released a press release saying that henceforth they were going to pay all of their staff, reward all of their staff on the performance against the organization's ESG goals. And it's that kind of additional high-level commitment, not just to the targets by 2050 for zero carbon or whatever those are, but a commitment to providing the internal support to allow procurement and supply chain organizations to make the changes necessary to hit those targets. So I think that there is a quandary there for many companies, that to continue measuring procurement success purely on the traditional Friedman doctrine of shareholder value alone, and actually adding into that a very different dynamic of measuring the performance against ESG.
Yeah, no, good comment, Paul, and it leads quite nicely into our next the next phase of the conversation. But it is that kind of it's not a contradiction. I can't quite think of the word, but it's that difficulty in leveling or balancing out the need for ESG growth and delivery with financial performance and shareholder return. Right? There's been a lot of talk over many years about, whether it's stakeholder capitalism or whatever it may be, purposeful business. But at the end of the day, and if you look at something like BlackRock, they're always pushing for this agenda. Not everybody in the investment community is in agreement. So, I mean, how does this, on a company level, when we're talking to finance directors, and how can we in procurement, really get beyond that stage where, this will, from time to time, have cost implications. It might not be a cost implication, total cost over, the lifetime of, and if you introduce the risk variables as well, that might have an impact there as well. But how do we convince finance to change their priorities and really come along with this journey? JT.
That's a great question, David. Just to build on the Friedman doctrine, in over 50 years ago, Milton Friedman said the social responsibility of a company, of a corporation, is to make more profits.
Yeah. And
that has served the American companies very well for the last 50 years. And his argument was that there is a principal and an agent. The CEO and the executive C-suite is an agency working on behalf of the principal owners of the company, who are the shareholders. So if the so the agent doesn't have any responsibility acting as a taxing agent in looking out for the society, planet, outside of the best interest of the owners. However, today, the same owners, same shareholders, and same principals are now realizing that there is an existential crisis here. So even with all the wealth for the shareholders, so there may not be a place and a happy, healthy place for us, and the COVID pandemic has actually proved that. And so there is not a happy, healthy place for us all to live. And so now the principles, so that's why the ESG has become a board topic. ESG is starting at the board because the shareholders are demanding it. Shareholders are holding the companies accountable for reporting all of their ESG metrics. They're pushing out, they're creating all these investment strategies, creating portfolios based on those ESG values. So there was a huge shift from the 50 years ago, the Friedman statement, to where we are today. And that's the driving force trickling down from the shareholders and the owners and then trickling down to the board levels. Now the CEO is responsible for creating an ESG strategy, goals, metrics. And now finally the regulation is catching up. As Neha mentioned before, there is a new, beyond the Paris Agreement, beyond some of the countries making pledges to where, the EU Green Deal and some of the, and now it has, the CSR directive is going to have actually very directive metrics that the companies are expected to report. And the same thing on the US side. The SEC issued a new ruling that's going through the public comment period right now for another 30 days. And when that is passed as the ruling, the companies will be required to provide those disclosures, and the assurances are required. So auditing is going to be required on those reporting of those ESG metrics. And if there is a material misrepresentation on any of those, and there would be liable for some of those penalties and shareholder lawsuits, etc. So I think so. If you're looking for the business case, where is my business case for ESG? I think right now it's in half of the companies we're working with, it's coming from top down. It's a mandate from the boards and the finance, including finance, on getting those disclosures accurately and measuring and reporting accurately. So which is good news for some of the procurement leaders and supply chain leaders who are actually looking for, who have the right intent, but did not have the support in the past, are now getting the full broad C-suite support for that. Now, coming back to some of the economics, like you said, this is putting, purpose along with the profits is become the mantra now. And if you look at some of the, the cost of the pandemic cost trillions of dollars to the world, and many companies actually can quantify it and what is the losses to those companies individually, and then some of the climate change has, like Texas freeze has cost hundreds of millions of dollars of cost to the companies. So now they're beginning to quantify some of those. If it's very specific, ESG incidents that could potentially have significant losses to the company. These are, short-term, medium-term losses. We're not talking about the long-term brand value, long-term growth in the market share by doing more good to the planet. We're talking about very material, tangible costs that the company would incur if they did not take on these, the ESG strategies and apply them in the short and medium terms.
Okay, thanks, JT. Neha, Paul, anything to add there, or shall I move on? Let's move on then. What about frameworks that companies can adopt to start to formalize activities, and reporting as well? Is there something that's kind of off the shelf, something that's simple to deploy and get going with, or is this unique to every company out there? JT, can you take that?
Sure, David. So I think, as I mentioned before, I think there's a plethora of frameworks, but I would highlight there's about 5 of them that kind of emerged in the last 2 years as some of the leading standards. GRI actually merged last year with the Global Reporting Institute, and then the IIRC, which is the International Integrated Reporting Council, and they've created this value reporting. Not the GRI, the SASB and IIRC have merged together and created value reporting. That today is probably the most leading standard, I would say, the Sustainable Accounting Standards Board, which covers 77 sectors. So depending on some of the companies, some of the corporations may be part of multiple sectors, depending on how many different products, diverse products and services they have. And they also provided a very nice way to map, take your ESG reports. Your ESG reports can be as part of a sustainability report. It could be part of annual report. It could be part of your 10K, 10Q filings. Any of those, depending on how accurate and how complete they are. And there is a way you can actually take some of those metrics that you're reporting, tie that back to with references, index it back to the SASB reporting structure. So in the CDP and in the UN SDG, is Sustainability Development Goal, there are 17 broad level goals, and then there are 169 specific targets within UN SDGs. Those and GRI would cover the things that are outside of your 4 walls of the company and the impact of the impact outside of your company. And the SASB specifically covers some of the things that are impactful to the valuation of the company, the specific financial valuation of the company, and for the investor communities. Many companies that I've seen is choosing a combination of GRI plus SASB reporting, or UNSDG plus and SASB reporting. So those are some of the disclosures. My suggestion is someone who's looking to kind of decide, on a framework, is start with the, SASB website. They're a nonprofit company. There is a ton of available metrics and frameworks and methodologies that's available there, and then do of course, you might need some. Either you do it internally or you get some external help to do the material, the assessment, to decide which are the key topics are most material for your company, depending on the sectors you're operating in, industries you're operating in, specific products and services you have. So that's the material purpose of the materiality assessment. And once you have done those, then you can choose the right metrics and you can choose one of these frameworks. But I would start with the SASB reporting. There is actually hundreds of companies like Walmart and many other companies are already reporting on that. You could take samples of what those standard reporting looks like. What metrics are they reporting? How are they referencing back to the standard frameworks and reporting metrics? So those are comparable across companies, and they're also measurable year over year across how the companies are performing towards those metrics.
Good stuff. Thanks, JT. I'm mindful a little bit of time. We have had quite a lot of questions come in already, and I'm keen to get to them. So we'll move on to the next stage of this conversation. And Paul, can I turn to you? And it's moving from frameworks to technology, right? So technology is always going to be part of challenges as large as this. I mean, what role does or can tech play? Are there tools that exist already to help solve for this? What future developments are in the pipeline as well? Maybe you can give us a view on that.
Sure, absolutely, David. Technology is going to play a critical role in this in one of 2 ways. The first is that if we don't get the technology right, then it's going to be a great hindrance to our performance against these targets. As JT has just explained, there is a huge amount of data requirement associated with meeting these targets and actually becoming more successful as sustainable organizations. And that is data that is coming in, the data that we need from our Scope 3 suppliers and all of the emissions data, all of the nth level information that is coming from down in the supply chain, but also the information that we need to report out as well. The challenge is the technologies on which we are currently running procurement and supply chain operations were not built for a world that was wired that way. And so if we're trying to continue day-to-day procurement and supply chain operations using the existing metrics that we have, it's going to be extraordinarily difficult to manage all of the acquisition and processing of that data and the reporting of that data unless we suddenly get a massive injection of cash to staff up teams to do exactly that, to create parallel systems. And that's not going to happen either. So the imperative on technology providers is to come up with a way of actually synthesizing that critical data from the field, the emissions data, the supplier data, all of that additional enriched kind of information that we currently don't have access to, and bringing that into play into our day-to-day operations. And there are two ways in which that could happen. The first is that you could go out and specify an entire system just to do all of that, to run in parallel to the existing systems that you have maybe running on your ERP or whatever that you're managing procurement and supply chain. But that's going to be prohibitively expensive. I think, and one of the things at GEP that we feel very strongly about is that if we can embed the critical information that you need throughout the whole process of managing procurement and supply chain, so that wherever you have to make a decision, you have the right information at hand to allow you to make the correct decision as far as your ESG goals are concerned, then it leaves procurement and supply chain operations to carry on and continue with their day-to-day operations in a kind of traditional mold, but actually contributing to the ESG goals and contributing to the sustainability metrics. So what does that actually look like? Well, JT's already mentioned spend analysis and how spend analysis can be more meaningful if, as well as having the spend data, you also have all of the greenhouse gas emissions data synthesized into the same reporting framework. But it goes beyond that. Not only can you say, okay, which categories do we need to actually source right now? Which categories do we need to focus on in order to reduce our footprint? But it can also be incorporated into how you actually tactically go about executing against those strategies. So, for example, during the sourcing process, if you're choosing which supplier to select, which group of suppliers, which territories to work with, which supply chains to engage with, having the metrics data present in your sourcing system at that time is going to be key to not extending the amount of time and effort that it takes to make that decision. Again, when you're creating a contract, you need the contract system to tell you that there are risks associated with this particular category and that there are mitigation clauses and particular KPIs that you should build in order to make your goals more achievable in the future. And in particular, in the area of supplier performance management, supplier relationship management, you need to know at every step of that relationship, perhaps over a period of years, how your supplier's performance, how their metrics in the ESG world are measuring up against your benchmarks. And it comes all the way down to right at the end of the process where somebody is buying a particular item from a catalog. They need to be given the information to say, well, this is the one that has the needle firmly in the green against the circularity or the materials use or the heavy metal content, whatever it may happen to be, or indeed steer people away from even having visibility of those commodities that no longer meet the company's standards. So integrating all of that data into the day-to-day process is really where procurement software, supply chain software companies should be focusing right now, and that's why I think it's incredibly important.
And does that exist today?
It doesn't exist today. Because it's a very nascent field. What organizations like GEP are working on is integrating the various different key data feeds that are out there. So there are third-party feeds. I see there's a question already come in about, how do you get that deep scope 3 emissions data? Well, the data does exist, but it's bringing it in and synthesizing that with the with the day-to-day systems that you have. Certainly that is our philosophy of what the future of procurement and supply chain software looks like. And just within the GEP realm, we're working very hard to create that next generation of green, more sustainable procurement software.
That innovation is happening, David. The innovation is happening on analytics, for instance. The data does exist, the spend data, the pricing, the supplier information, but then triangulating that with what suppliers have with external sources. I'll talk human rights, for instance. There's a lot of information, but being able to synthesize that and say that against your spend and against these raw materials, here's the risk, here's what you should be doing with that. Today, what happens in spend data analytics is it tells you, okay, now is the right time to source because here's the pricing trend. But now, beyond that, the innovation that's happening, GEP is putting a lot is, here's your supplier data, the supply chain mapping, here's where the risks are, here's what you should be looking at. And as Paul mentioned, there's a lot of happening on the data side. It's going to eventually permeate the sourcing process, the contracting process, the buying process, eventually the entire supply chain execution as it relates to supply collaboration, forecasting, inventory and warehouse decisions. So again, it requires that data and then showing up at the right spots so that whoever the end user is making the right decision, not just for cost purposes or supply chain continuity, but also with ESG in mind. And so I think there's a ton of innovation happening. Of course, there's startups who are focusing on one particular area. Just like procurement started many, many years ago, there were individual companies who focused on auctions and different areas. We eventually believe that an entire end-to-end procurement supply chain with sustainability data built in at the right decision points will be the future. But that innovation at specific point solutions, of course, and then, of course, GEP is doing, is happening as we speak.
I think that's exactly the point, David, is as Neha said, it's about the decision points. Because the procurement professionals, they just need to decide which supplier should I award this business to. And part of that metric, of course, is going to be cost, it's going to be efficiency, it's going to be service levels, but it also has to be the impact that it has against the ESG goals. And if we don't integrate that into the same set of data that is currently being used to just make that decision, then it's just going to be business as usual, and procurement teams are going to find it very hard to play their part in contributing to the total result. So that's why we think it's critically important to make that connection.
Okay,
a quick comment there, David.
Yeah, if it can be brief, Jay. I want to get to the questions. If you can be
sure. Yeah, I think Neha and Paul covered some of the how responsible sourcing can be integrated as part of the technology. What we're doing, and it is a continuous process right now, is codifying all of the emission factors. So if you have $1 billion of spend, how much does $1 billion of spend translate into greenhouse gas emissions? So that's, for example, I'll give you one specific example. If you have $100 million on travel, and so we know, with a 10-20% accurate, within the range of 80-90% accuracy, we can say, okay, this is how much the greenhouse gas emissions are coming based on, let's say based on air travel. We have codified the emission factors based on long haul, short haul, and then the rental cars based on the mix of hybrids and the SUVs and the midsize and small cars, et cetera. So that journey is an ongoing journey. That's what the GEP green platform is, codifying all of those emission factors to bring accurate information on the greenhouse side, the environment and the climate side. So that's where some of the technology is. And then the second part of it is just the dashboard. Once you set your targets, how can you kind of track it against those metrics and then report on those metrics? So the dashboarding and reporting is another function of technology we're building.
Okay, good stuff. Thanks, JT. We did want to just close off with kind of almost actions and first steps, and how do we build on momentum and really sort of like keep moving forwards. I mean, I'm happy to do that if you're brief with your responses. So why don't we do that? We'll go to each of you and then we'll go to the questions. So how do we, get going quickly? Neha.
I think really I'm going to talk about procurement supply chain. Connect your procurement supply chain goals with your overall corporate ESG goals if they haven't, that hasn't happened already. And identify at least high impact opportunities to at least kind of get started and start making a difference. I think you can boil the ocean, or you can kind of focus on like a few specific areas to kind of get started. And of course, whether internally or get some help externally to identify that and execute with precision.
Thank you, Neha. JT.
Now, just building on what Neha said, I think on the, I'm going to go a little more into the environmental side and the climate side. I think there's a lot of work that needs to be done on the where the market doesn't need another reporting framework. Market doesn't need another survey. There's a lot of survey fatigue with the suppliers. What the market does need is, how do I measure? Like Paul said, take my data at the with my suppliers, and then how do I measure what my current baseline footprint is on the greenhouse gas emissions, for example, and then so how do I move that target down and then improve on that target, improve the performance. So really baselining that and setting those targets, and then developing and working with internal stakeholders as well as the suppliers to come up with joint targets, over the next 3, 5, 10 years to kind of eventually getting to that net zero by 2050. So that would be my recommendation.
Thanks, JT. Paul, anything to add?
I think the only thing that, the place to start for me is with an understanding that you don't have to throw out everything in order to start to make inroads into this. Eventually, a lot has to change, but it doesn't all have to change in one fell swoop. As Neha said, we don't try and boil the ocean. And so the idea being that if you can look at your supply base, look at your KPIs that you're associating with your suppliers, look at how you manage your supplier relationships and measure their performance, then start to integrate the ESG goals into that at an early stage. Is going to be much, much easier to continue that process going forward. So small steps to start with are going to yield big results in the future.
Okay, thanks, Paul. We are running a little bit late, so my apologies for that. For those of you who have asked questions, we have had a lot. The panelists today, I'm sure you've had a look at some of them, and maybe we can just take one. We've actually covered quite a lot of the areas that the questions are, sort of like focused on. So there's, about getting the correct data at the right time, transparency, etc. There's questions about mapping. There's questions about, the Scope 3 calculation. There's what should be on the roadmap. That's a very broad question. It depends on industry. It depends on corporate strategy, etc. But maybe this one that came in latest, it's not just about end-to-end supply chain impact on sustainability. If ESG is going to be weaved into the entire culture, it must take into consideration all the work being done across the enterprise. Do you agree?
Yes.
Yes. Yeah, it's a cultural shift across the whole organization that is required, and from the top certainly, but the top is not a sufficient condition. I think everybody has to, and for whatever the reason is, whether it's to build trust with the employee base, the customer base, whether it's to meet the requirements and avoid risk in regulation and fee, or just to do the right thing. It's a combination thereof that will drive a significant culture change for companies to really make a significant difference. So we strongly agree with that and believe that. And we're going through at GEP, we're going through that ourselves. We're making it's a culture shift that's happening from the traditional procurement supply chain metrics to something, as JT called it, more purpose-driven. It's very important.
Good stuff. Okay, well, we are just about out of time. Just to conclude, please do let us know what you think. As I said earlier, feedback does help us to improve. There are additional resources that will be made available to you after the webinar. And please do register for the next webinar as well, which you'll have access to following this. But all that's left to be said really is a big thank you to Neha, to JT and to Paul for joining us today. It's a massive challenge. It's a massive issue. It's, you know, the challenge of our lives. It's great that GEP is really focused on it, and it's exciting to see, you know, some of the work you're doing there. So thank you so much for the insights provided today. And thank you to everyone for joining.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, David. Okay.
Thanks, everyone, for joining.
Thank you.